Today is Thursday, March 26, 2026, and today is Make Up Your Own Holiday Day, which feels like the calendar briefly admitting that at some point someone just started inventing holidays, and the rest of us just politely went along with it. Welcome to This Day in History from, wait, that's random. I'm your host, C.L. Burns. On this date in 1827, Ludwig van Beethoven died in Vienna at the age of 56. By the end of his life, Beethoven had become one of the most influential composers in Western music. But what makes his story remarkable is that many of his greatest works were written while he was nearly completely deaf. He began losing his hearing in his late 20s. For a composer, that's the equivalent of a painter losing his sight. But Beethoven adapted. He studied the structure of music deeply enough that he could compose without needing to hear every note in real time. He sometimes pressed a rod against the piano and held it to his teeth so he could feel the vibrations of the instrument through his jaw. Instead of relying on what he heard, he relied on what he understood about harmony, rhythm, and musical structure. And that understanding pushed music forward. Early composers had written elegant, balanced compositions. Beethoven stretched those forms into something more dramatic and emotional, helping transition Western music into what we now call the Romantic era. When Beethoven's funeral was held in Vienna, an estimated 20,000 people attended. For a composer in the early 1800s, that was extraordinary. But Beethoven's music didn't just change how people composed. It also depended on a technology that would soon change another form of art entirely. Because once humans figured out how to record sound and performance, the next question was whether we could record motion too. On this date in 1885, the Eastman Film Company began manufacturing flexible photographic film. Before this invention, cameras relied on glass photographic plates. Glass plates could capture images clearly, but they were heavy, fragile, and required swapping out a new plate for every photograph. George Eastman's breakthrough was a flexible strip of coated film with light-sensitive chemicals. When light enters the camera lens, it strikes silver halide crystals embedded in the film. These crystals undergo a chemical reaction where exposed areas become part of a latent image that can later be developed into a photograph. Because the film was flexible and could roll through the camera, photographers could now capture many images in sequence. And once you can capture many images in sequence, you're very close to inventing motion pictures. Movies work because the human eye retains images for a fraction of a second. Something called persistence of vision. We talked about this just a few days ago. If you show images quickly enough, the brain blends them into a continuous motion. Flexible film made that possible. Without it, the movie industry and most modern visual media probably wouldn't exist in the form we recognize today. And interestingly, the next story also revolves around something that required technology, coordination, and timing to work. Just not cameras. On March 26, 1979, Egypt and Israel signed a historic peace treaty in Washington, D.C. For decades prior to this agreement, the two countries had been enemies. Since Israel's founding in 1948, several wars have been fought across the region, including the Six-Day War in 1967 and the Yom Kippur War in 1973. The peace treaty followed negotiations known as the Camp David Accords, mediated by U.S. President Jimmy Carter. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin agreed to terms that included Israel withdrawing from the Sinai Peninsula, Egypt officially recognizing Israel as a sovereign nation, both countries establishing formal diplomatic relations. The mechanism of the treaty was essentially a structured exchange of concessions: territory for recognition, recognition for peace. It was the first time an Arab nation had formally recognized Israel, and it reshaped political relationships throughout the Middle East. Which brings us to someone else born on this day who thought a lot about choices and consequences. Robert Frost was born on March 26, 1874. Frost became one of the most widely read American poets, often writing about nature, rural life, and quiet moments where people make decisions. His poem, The Road Not Taken, is often interpreted as a celebration of choosing your own path. But the poem is actually a little more complicated than that. It reflects on how people often look back at their decisions later and create stories about why those choices mattered. In other words, sometimes the meaning of a moment only becomes clear long after it happens. If you step back and look at these moments together, something interesting starts to appear. A composer creates music he can barely hear. A new material makes it possible to capture motion on film. And two nations find a way to end decades of conflict. Different problems, different centuries. But each movement involves people finding new ways to work within the limits they were given. Anyway, those are a few things I ended up reading about when wandering through March 26th. Stop by tomorrow and we'll see what other strange pieces of history the next date decides to reveal. If you want to know more about me or the work I do, you can find everything at waitthat'srandom.com. I'm C.L. Burns, and I appreciate you stopping by.